Before you were in there now.
You're gonna make announcements.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, gentlemen, it's we're gonna start in a minute or two. First, let's make some announcements. Day of Learning, a week of learning, sponsored by Sharon and Michael Glass to commemorate the Yahrzeit on the 16th of Sivan of Sharon's father, Erwin Cohen, Shlomo ben Yosef HaKohen. This coming Thursday is a Bagels and Lox breakfast. You have till today to make a reservation. We also have coming up on July 3rd, okay, who makes the best burger? Milty and I are going head to head, and we're gonna have a shiur. We have one opening for a judge. Also, if you would like to come and you would like to judge the contest, please let me know. Next week, God willing, we'll have Svi Fisher, who wish Kodesh Lunch and Learn. Hopefully he'll be back in Eretz Yisrael. That's a big if. And I think that's about it for now. Let's see. I put on record, right? Just look over here. Every once in a while.
Okay. Right.
I'll come around to look.
All right, so Mr. J.
But if you see that, then you just hit the admit.
Go back up to Gino.
Let me mute these people because it's not, start talking in the middle. Okey-doke. Ready to
All
go.
right, so the topic of my talk this morning is the Birchas HaMalshinim, and the bracha has always fascinated me. There are a number of things I mean, it now reads Bila Malshinim Al Sisibav B'chol Rishar Karega Taved B'chol Yevayim B'chol Me'er Yikresu V'Zadim Me'er Saker V'Shaber Smager Zechni B'Morimenu and Bracha Hashem Shomer Avim Machni Azedim. So there are a few things about the bracha that sound a little strange. The bracha is known as Birchas Haminim, as we call it, and yet in the version that we have in our Sidurim, we don't have the word minim. So why is it called Birchas Haminim if we don't mention the meaning? Another thing is a little strange is the bracha starts Bila Malshinim with a vav, and. Well, I think in third grade I learned you don't start a sentence with the word and. So why do we do that here? So I happen to be reading this book here by Marcel Simon, a book called Beros Israel, the study of the relations between Christians and Jews in the Roman Empire, AD 135 to 425. It's a book that belongs to that there, and I often take out some books and read them. This one was kind of interesting and discusses in part the questions I'm going to be talking about today. There's another book here by Ruth Langer and Tell, Cursing the Christians. Actually, there's an exclamation point. I mean, a question mark at the end. Cursing the Christians, a history of the Birchat Haminim. This book is considered to be the definitive work on the question. Well, I just got a copy, I borrowed a copy last Friday, so I have not read the entire book, but the part that I have read is quite interesting. And so I'm going to refer to both of these books as we go along. So the first question is, why was this bracha enacted? When was it enacted? We know it's the 19th bracha of the Shemona Esrei, and I'll read from the Art Scroll explained. Chronologically, this is the 19th blessing of the Shemona Esrei. It was instituted in Yavna during the tenure of Rabbi Gamliel II as Nasi of Israel, sometime after the destruction of the Second Temple, which 70 AD, so we know it was done after that. Exactly when, we don't know, but most authorities say it was probably done soon afterwards. The blessing was composed in response to the threats of such heretical Jewish sects as Sadducees, Boethians, whatever, Essenes, and the early Christians. They tried to lead Jews astray through example and persuasion, and they used their political power to oppress observant Jews and slander them to the anti-Semitic government. In this atmosphere, Rabbi Gamliel felt the need to compose a prayer against the heretics and slanderers, and to incorporate in the Shemona Esrei so that the populace would be aware of the danger. Okay, so that's the commonly accepted reason why the bracha was enacted. But it's not entirely clear that wasn't the case. And I'm going to digress a little bit and discuss some of the background, which I've learned from this book here. In other words, during the period this book covers, AD 135 to 425, the distinctions between Jews and Christians and other sects were not entirely clear. There were various sects that departed from what we now consider to be mainstream Orthodox Judaism and had their own ideas. Many of them involved the acceptance of Jesus. Some perhaps did not, still had a very different kind of religious practice than the mainstream Judaism. So, and there were also a number of interactions between the Jews and the Christians in this period, and it seems quite clear that sometimes these sects would come to the shul, and there's one interesting story in the Gemara from Avodah Zarah Daf Daled, where Rav Safra was accosted by one of these people in the sect, and he asked him a question. He has a pasuk: "Rak eschem yadati mikol mishpachos l'adamah al kein efkod aleichem es kol avonosechem." So we have that pasuk, and he asked him to explain the pasuk, and he remained silent. He indicated he doesn't have an explanation for it, and they were kind of surprised. It's supposed to be a great Rav. He doesn't understand this pasuk. I think most of you understand what the pasuk means. So why did he not respond? And they made fun of him. And then Rabbi Bahu tried to explain it by saying he only knows Torah Shabbal Peh. He doesn't know Torah Shebek Sab, which again sounds kind of ludicrous. Although I'm reminded that today, the same kind of a comment is often made about our yeshiva students. And the yeshivas, they often just teach Gemara. They don't teach Chumash. They don't teach Hanach. So, but so the question is, what's going on here? Why? Yeah.
When I first went into the field, for the first couple of years, we used to listen to Rabbi Wine's tapes.
Mm-hmm.
And I always remember this is something that always stuck in my head. So when I get something that it kind of sticks in my head, so the only difference between the Jews and the early Christians was that the early Christians had 614 mitzvahs. 614 was was what he called otherwise.
Right. No, that's correct.
They come to shul and they come down and they just believe that
So one of the this book suggests, and the other book also mentions, that it's possible that the main purpose of the bracha of L'Olam B'Shinim was not, as it says in the article considered as is generally accepted, just to enact a curse on the medium, but because of what you just pointed out, the Christians used to come to the shul, and today, can you imagine that the priest from St. Anne's Church would come to the Shomrei Torah and say, "Hey, I want to lead the davening this morning." That just couldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. even though we have a group today, they call themselves Messianic Jews. They say that they're Jews, even though they believe in Jesus. But even there, they wouldn't come to a show. But in those days, it did happen. And the other thing, which is derived from this incident here by Marcel Simon, is that he believes that the Christians or these sects used to ask the Jews the meaning of psukim, because they thought the Jews know the meaning the best. On the other hand, they try to interpret everything in the Torah to show that Christianity was predicted by the Torah. So this is one of the examples where it says, "Rak eschem yadati mikomim al kenef kor aleichem eskol avonosechem." So I'm going to visit all your sins on you. Well, what does that mean? So the Christian interpretation would be the Jews used to be the chosen people, but now because of their sins, God has rejected them. And that was the interpretation, it seems, that this Min, who talked to Safra, was trying to get him to say, and Rav Safra was aware of the fact that the whole thing was a trick. It wasn't that they really needed to know the pasuk. They were trying to trap him into saying something, that would be that would support their position, and therefore he realized it was best just to say nothing and not try to explain the puzzle, because they were just going to argue with him. And even today, the Christians do the same thing. And I'll just mention one thing I found this morning. There's one pasuk which is famous in Yeshaya, where it says, "Hine al mahara v'yaladet bein v'krasmo Emmanuel," and that's the word alma. The Christians translate as virgin. Now we know that that's not the meaning of the word. It means just a young woman. And they mistranslate. Now, this morning I was just doing a little research online, and I come across a website of some Christian group, and they have a question there. One of the members of this church said, "Hey, I spoke to this guy, and this guy told me that the word doesn't mean virgin; it means just young woman." And how can we, so what is this? This is one of our important texts. How come this guy said that? So the pastor answers, "The truth is that the word alma is not the technical equivalent of virgin, because they did not have such a word in Hebrew when Isaiah was written." I'm saying, what? This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Of course, we have the word bisulah, right? Not only is it in Yeshayahu, but it's in the Torah. How could you say there was no such word when Isaiah was written? It's utter nonsense. And yet the Christians often, even today, will find excuses. And I'll relate another incident that happened to me close to 40 years ago. I lead groups, I have led, I don't really do it anymore, but for many years I led groups of boys out to Philmont, to scout camp in New Mexico. And afterward, we'd often go for touring in various places. So a little bit less than 40 years ago, we had such a trip, and we decided to go to Colorado afterward and spend Shabbos in Colorado. We just were going to camp out in some forest. And I remember, I think it was July 4th weekend, we had trouble finding a campsite, but we finally did. And as we're getting ready to make Shabbos, this guy comes over to us and says, "Oh, we're having a campfire tonight, and why don't you join our campfire?" So we went over to the campfire, and what happened to the campfire? "And Jesus said to me this," and Jesus said, "Well, okay, well, this is not for us," so we left. And then, this guy comes over to us afterwards, and he starts telling us about all the proofs of the Bible for Christianity. And the one I'll never forget was with the pasuk in Shmos, "Ukachem abudas ezot utvaltem adam asher vigatem al hamashkov v'al shnei hamzilot." You put the blood on the doorpost and the two side posts, right? That's a proof of Christianity. Why? Because you've got the lintel on the doorpost. That's a sign of a cross, right? You know, they have all these weird explanations, and so we had these groups that would try to prove their case, and some of these groups not only were trying to infiltrate Judaism, but also that they would talk to the government and they would make the charges that were false against the Jews. So that's where Malshinim came from. It's either there to curse, as this book says, cursing the Christians, cursing these sects. Malshinim, assuming it means the early Christian, the Altis, or as is suggested in this book here, to weed these people out, because they would come to shul, as Mendy mentioned, as I mentioned, they would come to shul and try to read the davening. They get to the bracha al-Malshinim, and but it probably had at that point the word minim in there, and they know this is cursing us. I'm not going to recite a bracha that's directed specifically against me and my sect, so they leave out the bracha. And the Gemara says that if you encounter a person and he leads the davening, he makes a mistake, so ordinarily you just correct him and let him continue. But if it's in Birchas Haminim, you immediately remove him. So this would give the people in the shul a way to detect people who are coming there trying to infiltrate the davening and don't really believe in the principles that we do. So that's the other possibility of why the bracha was enacted. So now the question is, what does minim refer to? So I'll start by mentioning another word. We have the word goy, right? So what does goy mean? I say, oh, you're a goy. You got a goyish cup. Obviously, it's a negative, pejorative meaning. We're saying that person isn't Jewish. And we also have, of course, a bracha we recite every morning, Shalom Asani Goy. And that's the meaning of Goy in that context. But then we've got a bracha that we say every Shabbos afternoon, Ato Echad V'Shimcha Echad Mika Amcha Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz. Obviously, the word goy in that context is a very different meaning. And that's because the word goy originally basically means nation. A goy is a nation. So there, the word goy refers to the Jewish people. We have a similar situation with the word mean. So I just ate a bowl of cereals and make a bracha, bore mine bizonos. Does that mean that the Cheerios were made by a Christian? I don't think so. The word mine simply means types of. That's the original meaning of the word mean. It came to denote the various sects that had been that sprung up in the period, as I say, 135 to 425, around that period, where there were all kinds of different sects, Christian sects, and in Christianity was just developing in that period of time, and there were very many different Christian sects. There was a big machlokes. To what extent do we accept the Torah? I mean, they all agreed that Torah was at least originally the word of God, but some of them said, well, now it's changed. And some of them, though, said, no, we still have to adhere to it. And there is all kinds of different views, and we had sects. So that's where the word minim comes from, different kinds of sects. And does it refer to Christians? Maybe, but we'll see it's not necessarily clear that it only refers to Christians. It refers broadly to various kinds of sects. Okay, so now, what was the original text of this bracha? We know, or we just assume, as I mentioned before, it's called Birchas Haminim, yet the word minim is not mentioned in the version that we have in the Siddur today. Nowhere in this paragraph we have the word minim, but it seems pretty clear that originally it did have that word in there somewhere. Now, this book, which was written, I think, before World War II, and it talks here about how we're so fortunate that we can have we can find the original text, because let me say this here. We have the version from the Cairo Geniza. Everybody know what the Cairo Geniza was? There is. In Cairo, in Shiur in Fostad, which was then a suburb of Cairo, they used to, they had this room in the attic where they would just throw all kinds of manuscripts that were no longer needed and no longer usable, and they throw them in that room, and it remained untouched for close to 1,000 years. And then somebody noticed it, and Solomon Schechter came to Egypt, and he heard about it, and he purchased most of those things. And it's a real treasure trove of manuscripts that date back to about the year 1000. And we've learned a tremendous amount from that Geniza. And in the Geniza, there are a number of texts, and what I gave out to you, this sheet here gives you, it gives actually that there are 7 versions, 1 through 6, but this is 4A and 4B, that they found quite a number. If you add this all up, it ends up being like about 70 or 80 or something like that, different manuscripts, which they categorize into 7 categories, which show what the text of the bracha was in the versions in the Geniza. Now, Marcel Simon says, oh, this is the original version, so we now know what the original version is. But remember, the manuscripts in the Geniza date back to year maybe 1000. This was enacted about, let's say, 80, 100, 900 years earlier. We know that plenty of changes have been made in the bracha in the last 1,000 years, so it's certainly reasonable to assume that changes were made in the first 1,000 years. And we don't have any definitive knowledge of what the original version was. In the Gemara, it just says that they were mataking the bracha, but it doesn't give the text of the bracha. So we really, and that's what this book, which I would like to have read it more earlier, but I just got the book, borrowed it last Friday, and only read the first part of the book. But the first chapter of this book talks about how we just don't know what the original version was, because the earliest version we have is from the Geniza, and the Geniza dates back only to about the year 1000. So, and what the author here does is that she puts together these 7 different versions. And let's just take the 5th version, which had only 6 manuscripts, but this version is the one that's most similar to the version that we have today. So I'm going to focus on this one. La Meshumadim al Sikva. Now, all 7 of the versions that we have here start with word La Meshumadim. The Meshumad, of course, means someone was Jewish, and he renounced Judaism. And I found it really interesting that every single version has this Meshumadim, which is a word we don't have in our current version. We have Malshinim. And why it was changed, I don't know, but I will read more of this book. I might want to give another class about the changes that have been made since the Geniza. But at this point, I haven't read the rest of the book, so I'm not prepared to talk about that. But it's interesting that they now all start in this Geniza version of Meshumadim. So here we got the minim. We now say now there was censorship in the Middle Ages, and the Christians read this, and they assumed, perhaps correctly so, that the word minim refers to Christians. So they're not going to let the Jews recite a prayer that curses the Christians. So they insisted it be changed. So it was changed at some point to word risha, evil, Okay, so evil is a general term, doesn't refer to any specific group and is more acceptable. Now, interestingly, the other versions that I have on the sheet, look down here, it says, "V'hanotrim v'haminim karega yovedu." Now, you notice you've got both terms, notrim and minim. Notrim clearly refers to Christians. Minim, if you have to say notrim uminim, it presumably means that minim is different than notrim, and perhaps you could say that minim is a broader term. It refers to the notrim, but also others who have heretical views. So each version that I have here, and this is Geniza transcription here, has the word minim somewhere in the, except, wait a minute, the last one doesn't. Okay, number 6 has already eliminated the word minim, but all the others, the first 5 have a notrim minim karega yovedu, and this one says the form minim karega yovedu. And again, yeah.
I also remember Rabbi Wein's tapes. He said for the first 100 years of Christianity, again, they believed in 14 mitzvahs. Then all of a sudden, the biggest troublemaker was called Paul/Saul, kind of convey that you can still be a Jew as long as you feel it in your heart, but you don't have to put on tefillin,
Right,
you don't have to
right.
keep Shabbos.
See, that was a big.
So maybe these different versions are
Right.
through time, because the Christians kind of like developed.
Right.
through
And
time
yeah, you see,
into different people.
what you pointed out is there was a big machlokas at early Christianity. Do we still have to observe the mitzvah? Some of the early Christians said, yeah, we accept Jesus as our Messiah, but we still have the Torah. And the Torah says we've got to keep kosher. And the Torah talks about Shabbos, we've got to observe Shabbos. And there were others that said, no, that's all been abrogated. Historically, that was for the Jews. In fact, there's even a view that says the mitzvahs were a punishment for the Jews because they did some bad things, and therefore they have to observe these things, but we don't. We've accepted our Messiah, and therefore we don't have to do any of this kind of stuff anymore. And it gradually developed, and that became the accepted view. But in the early period, that was not so clear. That's right, yeah. But they still disagreed or rejected the original, the views of the mainstream Jewish community. And as pointed out, that they made trouble for the Jewish community in many places. It wasn't a very peaceful relationship in most cases, although in some cases there was some tolerance. Again, it's a whole mixed up kind of a thing. That's why we have the word meaning. Okay. So I pointed out that with the exception of the last one, the word meaning appears in each one of these brachos. And I also, so let's just continue. And we have and Malchus Zodon, which is the word Zodon. We have Zadim. Zadim is translated as wanton sinners. So it means arrogant, insolent is another word that's been used, and people who basically reject the Torah and create problems. But it's a broad term. It can be interpreted very broadly and does not refer to any specific group. And then it ends up with the Shomer or Machnisim, which we have. Now, I will say that I was just looking this morning in our show, we have a version of Eidos HaMizrach Siddur, and that one starts off the bracha, Laminim Villa Malshinim, which would explain where that vav comes from. Most likely, the original text read, at least one of the original texts, Laminim Villa Malshinim, and then they took out the word minims, just leaving Villa Malshinim, I think. The other thing that's kind of interesting is the Geniza in Cairo. Remember, Cairo is a Muslim land. So if we have a bracha that curses minim and notzrim, the Muslim government there really couldn't care less because it's aimed apparently at the Christians. There weren't any Christians there, at least they weren't the ruling majority, so they didn't really care about the bracha. It was when you got to Europe, and Europe was controlled by the Christians, and of course they had censorship there, and they started reading the bracha and immediately demanded that it be changed. Now, the rest of this book, or a significant portion of this book, which is extraordinarily backed up, and it's got appendices and notes, and the amount of bibliography, this exceeds anything I've seen in any other book. It's really a real scholarly work, but I haven't really finished reading it. The main part of this book talks about what happened to this bracha between the Geniza text and today, where she talks about, of course, the changes were made in response to censorship, and also mentioned how Reformed Jews today deal with the bracha, because, of course, today we may not believe in the same things that our Christian neighbors do, but on the other hand, we don't really want to curse them. We live in harmony with them, and they are our friends, so we don't really want to have a bracha in the Shemona Esrei aimed specifically at them, especially today where they have, since Vatican II, at least until then, the mainstream Christian theology attacked Jews. After all, they're the ones that killed their Messiah. But today, even that has been attenuated. So the question is, what do we do today? And of course, the bracha we have today, which talks about Malshinim, Oivecha, Zaydim, can be interpreted in such a way as not necessarily to refer to Christians. I mean, it could be referring to the Ayatollah and Iran. Yeah, that would be very appropriate, of course, because they are really our enemies. But it's broad enough to be interpreted in a way that doesn't offend any specific group of people that we're living with. And so that's the way we have it today. And that's about as far as I can extend my talk today, because I haven't gone over the rest of it. If you want me to, at some future date when I've had a chance to look at this book some more, I have to thank Alan Friedman from TNEC for lending me this book. Apparently, it's not easy to find. I could give another talk about the subsequent history of the bracha, but I thought it was interesting seeing what we do know about it at the early time, up to the time of the Geniza. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay.
Very nice.
Thanks.
Very interesting.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed it.
Right.
I've been studying this for quite a while, but only yesterday.
You should try to get like Wein's tapes, that early Christianity. It's very,
Yeah,
very
well, that's
interesting.
what this book talks about very extensively. And it points out, as Rabbi Wein said, in some cases, they were almost Jews and they would come into the show.
Yeah, that's what he said. The only difference was that they believed in
And it's